All right, the recording should now have been started. If you're here, you're hopefully again still in my World Civilizations 2 class, and you've hopefully already viewed my introduction to the course that I posted before this one. If you haven't, I please recommend that you look over that, because if you don't, what's going on today and for the rest of the semester really probably won't make a ton of sense to you. Now, in the meantime, assuming that you have looked at the introduction, today we're going to be talking about the creation of the Atlantic world. So essentially how this sort of global Atlantic world and connection between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas started to occur. Let's see if I can get this to work. Voila. Now, the first thing I want you to be aware of is every single lecture you view for the rest of the semester is going to start off with these key terms. These key terms are going to be the main things you're going to want to focus on in your note taking, because they're what's mainly going to consist your content quizzes and writing assignments throughout the semester. For today, you're going to want to focus on Hernan Cortez and his association with the Aztecs, an indigenous woman named La Malinche, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Francisco Pizarro and his conquest of the Incas, the colonial labor systems we're going to look at, and social roles and class in the colonial world. Also, this is another thing that you're going to see throughout the entire semester. I'm always going to start off with upcoming dates as well. This is just going to give you another extra reminder for everything that's going to be due in the near future when you view these. First off, remember your syllabus contract is due August 28th at 5 p.m. You'll turn it in at the Moodle orientation section of your Moodle class, which again, I showed you this, I believe, on the first day, but just to show you again, it's located right here. You'll turn it in right here. Next up, your first writing assignment is going to be due September the 4th at 5 p.m. It again consists of 500 words, has to have a works cited page, has to have in-text citations, and you'll turn it in at the writing assignment 1 section on Moodle. That's also where you can find the prompt and where you can find the rubric. Now, first thing we're going to look at is the role of disease in the New World. The first thing I'll have you guys do is we're going to view this video sort of together of what disease might have happened in the Americas if disease didn't wipe out so many Native Americans, to sort of help us see maybe how disease did impact the New World. So let me go ahead and try to pull that up real quick for you. Might be pretty slow. Again, technology is not really my friend. All right, here it goes. We're probably going to have to watch a political ad. Sorry, that's most of what they give you this time. Or a Chromebook ad this time.
Oh no, did your game just get interrupted by an update? It's switching time to a Chromebook that updates automatically. Switch to updates without interruption. Switch to Chromebook.
My apologies for YouTube ads.
By the time the British colonies were established in North America, the Native American population was only 10% of what it had been. 90% of American Indians were killed by Old World disease. That's the equivalent of aliens exploring Earth only to fight a group of survivors, a mere shadow of what they used to be. Now, I'm not saying Native American people all had gleaming cities, well, some did, but it's often overlooked just how much disease played a part into Europe's conquering of the New World. Using alternate history, we ask a question. What if disease had not wiped out the Native Americans? How would interaction with the Americas go? Well, here is one scenario. In our timeline, the Columbian Exchange was the trade between the New World and the Old. Plants, animals, slaves, and disease traversed the Atlantic. Smallpox, being the most notable disease, ravaged the natives after first contact, causing an extinction-level event for the people. It broke down tribes, decimated villages, and paved the way for the Europeans. It's difficult to predict accurately just how much history would have changed had the plagues not occurred. Almost all interactions Europeans had with native people were with the post-disease survivors. Squanto, the famous native who saved the pilgrims from starvation, did so because his tribe, who previously lived on the land, all died from disease. Then he died from disease. There's going to be a lot of death in this video. Had the tribes of North America not lost most of their population, it's certain early English colonies like Jamestown would have been destroyed. Jamestown itself almost collapsed in our timeline, so it's certain it wouldn't have survived had a war with the natives broke out, which wars definitely would have. Since natives didn't have definition of borders like Europeans did, the arrival of fenced-in areas cut off access to previously tribal hunting grounds. This, causing tensions, usually fell into war. In our timeline, these wars/rebellions always ended in a British victory, but in this alternate scenario, just the sheer number of natives overwhelmed the British. With a much larger population, it would have been a deadly endeavor to remove tribes. Since wars were costly and counterproductive, it's likely colonist policy would be more towards trade than war, simply because you can't go to war if you are the vast minority. So the English colonists would need to maintain good relations with the more numerous native tribes. It's difficult to say what specific events would occur after this. The English colonies and future United States would only be possible because the land was opened up. It's likely the English, French, and Spanish would exert influence over the tribes, picking sides in tribal wars and making alliances with them and against each other. European outposts/cities would be founded on the coast with influence similar to that in India and China. Trades of guns, metal, and other Western technology bring an entire new face to Native Americans. Propped up by their European allies, Native states could eventually evolve to compete against other tribes/white colonists. However, over the centuries, once France and Britain gained a better foothold in the Americas, they began annexing tribal land, similar to the Middle East and Africa. In our timeline, the Spanish were able to take advantage of the plague. Both the Aztec and Inca fell into disarray once smallpox hit. Had these never occurred, the Spanish would still be able to eventually conquer both civilizations. Not popular with local tribes due to that whole human sacrifice thing, the Spanish still led a revolt against Aztec rule. The Inca put up more of a fight, but it would be impossible for the New World civilizations to fend off conquest forever. Simply because of the technological difference, the New World would have been conquered and influenced no matter what. The difference, though, in this alternate timeline is the demographics. Even if the European nations did claim land in the Americas, the native people would stay a dominant population in their homeland, like with Africa in the 19th century. Would they gain independence? Would native nations be formed where the United States is in our timeline? I'll let you figure that out. So much changed by the plague not occurring, it's difficult to accurately predict how much this affected the world. Like us on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate.
All right. Thank you for viewing that with me. If you did have, for some reason, I know it might be a little bit different with me streaming that video for you. So if it didn't quite work the way I wanted it to, please do let me know as soon as you can. However, I know a lot of this was a bit speculative because it's talking about what might have happened if disease hadn't played such a big role. But I want you to think a little bit about what it reveals about the impact of disease in the European conquest. Now I'll pause for a second for you to come up with your own answers, even though I can't actually hear them. All right. Of course, the main thing I want you to focus on is just the massive death toll. It mentioned at the beginning of the video that in certain parts of the Americas, native populations were knocked down by 90% by smallpox especially. Today, we're also going to, as you might have noticed, we're going to talk about the Aztecs and the Incas quite a bit. Disease played a huge role in the downfall of both of those empires. So it's entirely possible that none of this would have happened if smallpox hadn't devastated native populations as bad as they did. One thing I'd like you to also speculate about, and we'll discuss in the future, maybe is just how accurate this alternate timeline actually was. I'm not quite certain that the Spanish would have eventually been able to conquer all these kingdoms personally without the disease, but what do you think? How accurate is that? Also, whether it is accurate or not, what are some of the maybe disadvantages Native Americans did have in relation to Europeans besides just disease? Again, imaginary pause. All right, well, one that you hopefully noticed is that the technology is still different. Europeans as we're going to talk about, Europeans brought in a lot of metal weapons, brought in firearms and things like that. that still is a disadvantage, which you could argue, like the video said, could still have led to the conquest, but it still is important to recognize, as the video pointed out, that without all of the disease, the conquest would not have been so total, and the population decimation would not have nearly been as high. So the reason I started off with that is that's going to be a big factor in everything we talk about for really the next several weeks, is the role of all this disease. Now, more specifically, let's look at empire as a whole, because it's something we're going to talk about a lot as well. What exactly did the Europeans gain from establishing colonies and empires in the first place? Think, for example, why did we go to the Americas in the first place? What was Columbus, for example, looking for? As you might hopefully remember, he was trying to find India, and he was especially looking for good trade routes. A couple of specific examples. Europeans were always looking for precious metals. Why are these so important? Yeah, as you can imagine, they're usually very valuable, can be worth a lot of money, and also can be used in production and industry. So it gives all sorts of new wealth to the empire. Agricultural commodities are also important as well. Why are these so important? Well, for this, think about plantations. How did plantations typically work? Yeah, plantations were typically set up around a specific cash crop that could be sold back in the empire for the home country for a lot of money. So again, making a ton of money is really usually the biggest goal for setting up an empire. You can get metals or you can get agricultural stuff. Now, looking at some of the more specific conquests. Hernan Cortez is credited as the Spanish conquistador who led to the downfall of the Aztecs. He actually gained his first bit of wealth by becoming the mayor of Santiago in Cuba and became rich off of land labor grants. This is essentially where important Spanish conquistadors and colonists were given land and forced labor in the conquered territories. So again, his very career was started off of economic exploitation. Now, the invasion of Mexico began in 1518 when he was sent on a trade and exploration mission, but decided to invade instead. He defeated an invasion force in Tabasco in 1518 and eventually was granted admittance to Emperor Moctezuma of the Aztecs court in 1519. Eventually, by the 1520s, he invaded with 2,000 Spanish soldiers and over 50,000 indigenous allies. Like the video we watched earlier said, the Aztecs were very unpopular because of some of their human sacrifices and imperialistic policies. By October the 21st in 1521, they had sacked Tenochtitlan, the capital, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, and raided the imperial treasury. So basically, the empire was largely over by then, but by 1525, they captured and executed the last Aztec emperor. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, to be quite honest with you. Now, a couple things to remember. Again, why were indigenous allies so crucial in this conflict? Again, just look at the numbers. The allies outnumbered the Spanish by over 48,000. So without the allies, it would have been almost impossible for these Spanish conquistadors to win. And again, like we mentioned earlier, the Aztec Empire was so unpopular, they actually did have quite a bit an easy time finding allies to help overthrow them. Now, one person I want to focus on for this conquest, because frankly, women don't really get much of attention when we talk about conquistadors, is an indigenous woman in the Aztec Empire named La Malinche, which is one name she's known by. After his victory at Tabasco, something that was very common among conquistadors, unfortunately, Cortez was actually given an indigenous woman named Malinche, or also known as La Malinche, as a gift. She would eventually become his consort, which I put in parentheses because obviously it's very questionable but whether she consented to this or not, and also was famous or infamous for serving as his interpreter. Her role was actually so important in advising Cortez that some of his other fellow conquistadors credited her as being the biggest reason for his success besides God, which is obviously a very big compliment, I suppose, coming from a Spanish Catholic conquistador. Now, the reason I bring her up is I think she sort of shows the complexity for how natives had to react to the conquistadors. Throughout history, Mexicans have seen La Malinche in quite a variety of ways. Some consider her to be a founding member of the New Mexico and the New Mexican race. So they basically consider her like their George Washington, like their Adam and Eve almost, like their Lenin if you're a communist. basically like one of their founding fathers, essentially. Some also consider her to be a traitor to indigenous Mexicans because she helped, arguably, Cortez conquer the Aztecs and conquer indigenous Mexico. It's actually gotten to the point, and you can even Google this if you'd like, where we're calling someone a Malinche in Mexico or in Latin America is essentially considered the same equivalent of calling them a Judas. It's become a slang term for calling someone a traitor to their people or a traitor to their country. More recently, feminists especially have seen her as a victim of colonialism who was basically caught between two cultures and had to try to find some way to survive in both. Now, what did this maybe reveal about the complexities of Native response to civilization, or colonization, I mean? Again, fake pause. Well, again, I just think it shows, again, it's a great example of the crazy ways indigenous people had to react to colonization to survive. It is quite possible that she just served in this role because she didn't want herself and her people to be killed or wanted to protect as many as possible. Also, it shows the way in complex ways that people who work with the colonists are remembered. And so again, it's arguable that she was just a victim being taken advantage of by the Spanish, but many people still consider her to be a traitor. So again, colonization has had a very complex and controversial impact that still affects our world today. So that's why I think it's important to remember people like La Malinche. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Next up on our major conquests, we'll look at the Incas. The Incan conquest was led by a man named Francisco Pizarro, who was another Spanish conquistador. He also started off in a similar way to Cortez. He became the mayor of the Panama City colony in 1513 and also got his wealth through land grants. Fortunately for him, he began his voyage to the Andean Incan Empire in 1530, 1 year after smallpox killed the emperor's heir. Why is that so significant? Again, imaginary pause. As you might imagine, having a contested succession to the throne could potentially get the Spanish some allies and help them take advantage of a divided empire. And again, it's just one more example of how important smallpox was in clearing the way for colonization. By November 16th in 1532, Pizarro had actually managed to capture one of the emperor's warring sons in an ambush with no casualties at all. This son actually offered the Spaniards a room full of gold and silver for his release, which you can see being stacked up here, but they executed him anyway, even though he fulfilled the task, on July 26, 1533. By 1535, Cuzco, the capital of the Incan Empire, was captured and sacked, and the new capital, Lima, was created by the Spaniards the same year. So again, another fallen empire, another relatively, I'd say at least, controversial ways of acquiring wealth, and the influence of disease. Now, a couple more factors in the Spanish success. Besides disease, there are a couple of others worth mentioning. One, as you'll notice, they attacked the top leadership immediately. Cortez went right for Moctezuma. The Spanish and the Incan Empire went straight for the emperor's son, which name was Atala. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that either. Again, these leaders a lot of times expected to be treated with deference. The Spaniards went straight for them. They both also, of course, took advantage of internal conflict. As I mentioned earlier, Moctezuma had many rebels who didn't like him, and the Inca Empire was currently fractured due to a war of succession in the case of this guy again, whose name I won't try to pronounce. Of course, again, disease had a huge impact, devastated the Aztecs population, literally killed one of the emperor's heirs with the Incas. And finally, as I mentioned earlier with technology, the Spanish had horses and steel weapons / armor, which also did give them an advantage, even though they were sometimes outnumbered. Now, just again, we'll briefly go over some of the characteristics that the Spanish Empire had in common before we move to other areas of colonization. The extent was actually quite massive. In South America, they went all across Bolivia, Chile, and Peru. Throughout North America, they went through Arizona, modern-day Arizona, Mexico, and New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Florida. As I mentioned, we're talking about the economic importance of colonies. The exploitation of resources was a huge part of colonization. Most of the Spanish wealth was derived from forced native labor to collect natural resources. Silver was mined in Bolivia and Peru, which you can see here. Gold was mined in Chile, and mercury was mined in Peru. After a while, by the 1540s, the Spanish also required labor assignments or repartimientos all across their colonies. This was literally just where you had to provide labor for the state, or otherwise you would be punished, mutilated, killed, all sorts of horrible things. Also, a Creole class started emerging all across these colonies. These would be more elite colonists, often of mixed racial heritage, especially geared towards Spanish heritage, who would buy political positions from the Spaniards and cause the empire to be somewhat decentralized. So it made the colonies less connected to the Spanish crown, but they were still ruled by elite colonists who dictated their every move, essentially. Now, we'll also go into North American colonization a little bit. North American colonies struggled in comparison to their Spanish counterparts, mainly because they lacked access to precious metals that a lot of these Spanish colonists had. The North American colonies were survived were able to do so by adopting cash crops. A cash crop, as I already mentioned a little bit, is a crop produced primarily for being sold at a large scale, usually back in the mother country. Some of you hopefully might already know of some cash crop examples. Again, imaginary pause. All right, the two ones you're probably the most familiar with are tobacco and cotton. Tobacco and cotton are going to eventually, as we'll talk about, become huge staples of the North American economy. Now, just a quick rundown of some of the colonies established in North America. It was primarily established by the English, French, and Dutch. Now, quick question. Even though since North American colonies struggled so much, why did they have to go there? As you've hopefully guessed, again, look at the extent of the Spanish Empire. They basically got dibs on South America and Southern North America. So the British and the French and the Dutch essentially just had to go where the Spanish weren't. So, for example, the British founded Jamestown in 1607. Quebec was founded by the French in 1608. British founded Plymouth in 1620, Boston in 1630, and New Amsterdam was founded by the Dutch in 1625, which, of course, as you might know, is modern-day New York. Initially, most of these colonies were established by a fur trade, which is when they would sell furs acquired from Native Americans back home and lead to a lot of alliances with indigenous confederations, which is somewhat referred to a little bit in that video I showed you where they trade them guns and other materials for those furs. For example, the British and the French, especially the French, traded with the Iroquois Confederacy, which was located in northeastern America primarily. The British especially traded with the Powhatan Confederacy in the Chesapeake Bay and Appalachian Mountains area. I personally believe that it's important to acknowledge these confederacies because, as the video stated, a lot of times we underestimate the impact of disease in wiping out these populations. There were actually a lot of pretty sophisticated indigenous societies before Europeans got here. So it wasn't just like Europeans brought civilization to the New World for the first time. It was already here. They just didn't really see much of it because their diseases killed everything, essentially. Now, collapse of the confederacies, again, of how this went across these confederacies and in North America. The Iroquois were forced to sign a treaty with France by 1701 due to smallpox, and they were splintered by the Powhatan Confederacy, was disbanded officially by 1646. Excuse me. Now, another issue that led into the collapse of these confederacies is something the video referenced as well, the gun trade. Introducing guns to these Native American rivalries helped them dominate and conflict with old rivals. So when they got access to guns, they could now more effectively fight against each other. For example, by 1725, the Comanches had expanded into Apache territory, which is located out roughly in this southern Midwest area. By the early 1700s, the Sioux and Cheyenne had expanded into Great Plain territory, which is this more Midwestern area. And again, shows some of the negative impacts of colonial trade. It does help both sides benefit off of each other by getting things they lack, but it also gives both sides the ability to better compete and fight against each other, which doesn't always go great, obviously. Well, the last thing we'll look at is the colonial labor systems. I can't believe I almost pronounced that colonial. That was weird. Now, both the North and the South American colonies were what most historians credit with helping European society elevate in comparison to the rest of the world because of the exploitation of those resources. Excuse me. Now, for example, in the Spanish colonies, you had patio or silver mining, which was the exploitation of indigenous labor in Peru and Mexico for this silver. It was actually so bad that most laborers were killed within 2 quote-unquote recruitment cycles. Again, just to remind you, these were not really recruitment cycles, it was more of a requirement. Next up, you had haciendas, which you can see here, which were somewhat of a plantation estate system, which were set up where laborers would grow wheat and raise livestock for the same family over generations. A lot of these haciendas are beautiful, quite frankly. You can still see them today, but they were, again, still used by exploitation of native labor and can be found across various Spanish colonies. Finally, the plantation system especially became popular in the Caribbean and in North America. These specifically produced cash crops, and as we'll go into in more detail in a little while, were responsible for popularizing African slave labor due to the smallpox epidemic. Now you might ask, what did the smallpox epidemic have to do to African labor? Well, it's another one of the more depressing aspects of world history. Literally, indigenous labor got wiped out because of the smallpox epidemic, so many of these places were forced to turn to African slave labor instead. Sugar, tobacco, and rice was often produced in the Caribbean. This was fully established by 1750. And tobacco and rice was heavily produced in Virginia by 1660, and Georgia joined the game by 1750. All right. Lastly, we will look at some of the social roles in class and other aspects of the colonial world. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but you are free to check back with this anytime you need to. As I mentioned, first you had the Upper Creoles. These are the descended from the Spanish conquistadors and the original estate holders. They had a lot of intermarriage and had a closed society and relied upon forced labor. Next class were the manufacturers, who were lower Creoles, maybe more descended from the indigenous ancestors. They produced textile, pottery, all sorts of stuff, and were supposed to be great craftsmen, but still usually relied on Native American labor. The Metzios and the Mulattoes were the second class. These were an even more mixed class. Actually, we still use some of these terms today, essentially. First off, you had the Metzios, which had a Spanish father and a native mother. Then you had the Mulattoes, who had a Spanish father and a black mother. These groups only held intermediate positions in society because, as you might imagine, they were considered somewhat okay because they had Spanish ancestry, but they had enough indigenous ancestry that no one really wanted to give them a high position. Women didn't have much of a position in society, as you would imagine. Elite women, as you can see with this woman right here, she would have had no power outside of her household and could actually be killed or banished by her husband or father for quote-unquote impurity. Lower class women, as you can see here, were more likely to be in the workforce, especially in the service industry. You can see with this woman right here, taking care of the children of the conquistadors and Spanish descendants. They might ask why they would be more likely to be working. Again, imaginary pause. As you might imagine, it was largely because these families relied on more labor, even more than the rich ones did, so everyone had to be involved in trying to work just to survive. All right, lastly, we'll look at colonial religion. Catholicism and Protestantism were the two dominant belief systems Europeans spread to the New World. Catholicism was spread by the Spanish and the Portuguese specifically. The two most popular orders were the Franciscan order and the Jesuits. They actually believed that the fall of the Incas and the Aztecs signaled Christ's second coming, which prompted their missionary work. As you might imagine, this is an important part of colonization because missionary work was used to justify it. They encouraged the veneration of saints, good works, and the Virgin Mary / pilgrimages. One thing that I do think is worth noting on, for those of you who are considered familiar with Catholicism, the saint system is actually very similar in some ways to more paganistic beliefs of Native Americans. A lot of historians have argued that that's why Catholicism was initially actually more successful in their missionary work, because Native Americans with polytheistic religions can better understand the saint system than the Protestant system, which just mainly focuses on God the Father and God the Son. Protestantism, of course, was very popular in North America after a while. It was where you get these splinter groups that are coming for religious freedom, quote unquote. So first you have the anti-law Puritan group, popularized by Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams founded a Rhode Island colony in 1636, and the Salem witch trials occurred in 1692, which is a great example of the mixing of colonial and Christian religions. A Native American slave actually was practicing partial African and Christian voodoo practices, which led to the mass hysteria of people worrying about demonic and witch possession, leading, of course, to the famous trials. Also, by the way, if you want more information on that, please take American History 1 at some point. There, I or another instructor will be able to go into a lot more detail about these. So again, final reminders, these are when some of your upcoming assignments are due. Please ask me if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you all next week.